Hey y'all, Eli here. I know I got a haircut and I look bad, but I did get the opportunity today to talk to my friend Emmett, who worked both as an assistant for Nina Totenberg, as a Supreme Court reporter, and also as a lobbyist for the Quakers. I thought his story is really interesting, so I decided to talk with him and bring that conversation to you all today. I hope you enjoy. However, unfortunately, something went wrong with the video recording, and I was only able to capture about a quarter of Emmett's face. So because of that, I decided to instead just place a photo of us instead of an active video of us talking. Nevertheless, I think the conversation was really interesting and insightful, and I hope you enjoy it. Hello, Emmett. Thanks for joining me today. This is my first run of a podcast kind of conversation with interesting people who've lived interesting lives. I'm Eli. You're Emmett. Why don't you give us a little introduction?
Hi, Eli. Happy to be here. I'm intimidated to be the premier interesting person, but I hope that you'll find plenty more interesting people after me. My name is Emmett. I am a second-year law student at Yale Law School. I am from Pennsylvania originally, and I am excited to be here.
You're my guinea pig, but
Yes, I
I
am.
thought
I'm
your
happy to
back
be.
before I met you and you told me about your background, I was like super fascinated because it's not every day that you meet someone who has worked with Quakers, and it's not every day that you meet someone who's worked as a lobbyist for Quakers. So I found this story super fascinating given the history of the Quakers. And so I was hoping you could just tell me a little bit about what your experience was, what you did there, what it's like to be I guess you're not yourself a Quaker, but you know what it's like to work in politics with them and the sort of beliefs that they hold.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was definitely one of the highlights of my professional career, and certainly the time that I spent between law school and college. So I worked at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, which is a public interest lobbying organization affiliated with the Quakers, based in Washington, D.C. It's an organization with about 40 to 50 people on staff who work on a variety of different policy topics. I'd say there's probably about 12 areas that they work on in total, about six foreign policy and six domestic policy. And it's basically what it sounds like. They're lobbyists in the public interest. So they go and they build relationships with members of Congress, and they advocate for their position on various issues. I would say, for the most part, they align pretty neatly with what you would consider, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, particularly on foreign policy. I think that they're especially strident in their views, and more progressive in their views. And that relates to kind of part of the element of your question there, which was, what do Quakers believe? Obviously, there are a lot of things that Quakers believe, and not everyone agrees on everything within the church, but the Quakers are known as one of the three historic quote unquote peace churches.
Mm-hmm.
And so very foundational to their worldview is a stance on pacifism that's rooted in a deep theological belief in nonviolence. And so they oppose basically all types of military intervention. They certainly want to see Pentagon spending go way down. And just in general, they want a much less militarized U.S. foreign policy that focuses on diplomacy and peace building, as opposed to bombing people and droning and surveillance and all that.
So can you tell us a little bit about like the day-to-day interactions with Congress members, with their staffs, and maybe if there's a different view coming from a religious organization versus coming from, I don't know, whatever other advocacy group walks in the door?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I was at FCNL as a young fellow. This is a program that they have for recent college graduates. So I spent a year working at FCNL right after coming out of college. Actually, it was literally, I started 2 days after my wedding. So I got married on August 26th, and then my work started on August 28th.
What's more
And
romantic than pacifism,
I know
right?
that was it was some would say that I skipped out on my honeymoon. I would say that I had a year-long honeymoon of doing peace activism. So that's a rosy spin on it. But it was I'll continue this sidetrack for just one moment to say that the first day that we came in, it was the first day for all the young fellows. And so they had a big staff meeting to introduce us. And the icebreaker question that the whole room went around and asked was, what did you do over the weekend? Or it was like the most interesting thing you did over the weekend. And so everyone else was like, I went hiking, or I went bowling, or whatever. And then it got to me, and like literally I got married that weekend. I got married on Saturday. So people were, I
That's
think,
unique, right?
yeah, I think I set the tone
Maybe you
for
got
being there
married
as a
just
big
so that you'd have
romantic.
something to talk about on your first day. It's like, shit, I don't have anything interesting
Yeah,
to
that's
do.
right.
I've got to get married and tell everyone about it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So that was my foray into the organization, and it just got more romantic from there. Absolutely. So to get back to your question, I started by saying that to say that I was my role in the organization was with the communications staff. So some of my day-to-day responsibilities weren't as central to like going to the Hill every day. I wasn't personally a registered lobbyist, and the threshold for having to register as a lobbyist is if you spend at least 25% of your time going and visiting members of Congress. So I didn't meet that threshold because I wasn't working on a particular policy portfolio. Instead, what I was doing was mainly engaging with FCNL has a very broad support group, mainly built up of Quakers who are constituents of the organization, either because they're donors or they're volunteers or they're just interested in what the organization does, or certainly if they're practicing Quakers, their congregations will keep them updated on what FCNL does. So there's this whole kind of network of people throughout the country who really care about what FCNL does and are very inspired by them. So I was working on communicating to them through our email list and our website and our social media and so forth. But probably the biggest internal responsibility that I had at the organization was as the communications staff, I needed to work with each policy department to kind of, for one thing, help them hone their messages in a way that would be very compelling to a public facing audience, but also I had to be in there with them so I could understand the arguments that they were making to members of Congress and the particular nuances of the policy stances that they were taking. So I got a great perspective on lobbying from that perspective, and definitely did go lobby many times myself. So I would say the lobbyists who work at FCNO, they're going on the Hill pretty much every single day. They're talking to members of Congress or their staff. They're going to briefings that happen all the time on Capitol Hill, or they're throwing briefings themselves. And they're also, when they're not on the Hill, they're researching their policy issues, or they're trying to figure out who are the key members that we can try to target for a swing vote.
And do you think that the lobbying that the organization does is effective, and if so, like on what terrain? And I think it's difficult for lobbyists in general without a ton of money or influence or donations to be effective in Washington. And where do you think your impact comes from?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and it, I think helps dispel not so much a myth as a real feeling of defeatism that progressives have. When you say the word lobbyist, you rightly think of like an old white guy in a pinstripe suit who has goes golfing with members of Congress and is really, there's like this greasy kind of gross, maybe even incestuous interplay of influence between them. And you've heard of the revolving door of members of Congress going in and out of Congress. And yeah, certainly there is a huge aspect of lobbying, which is the corporate lobbyist wing of that whole industry, and they have a ton of influence and access. But there are also there's a lot of really important work being done by public interest lobbyists as well. And a lot of the tactics that they use are very similar. So they're building relationships with members of Congress by getting to know them personally, getting to know their family, getting to know their staff, becoming a trusted source of information. And just basically when someone hears, when a member of Congress hears the name FCNL, or if they hear the name of a particular lobbyist who works there, is that a name that inspires confidence and faith in them? Now, some of the reasons that I think FCNL does a particularly great job at inspiring that type of confidence. For one thing, you asked initially, is there any difference between what a normal progressive lobbyist can do and what a faith-based progressive lobbyist can do? And I think that there actually is. You'd be surprised to hear that there is actually a very well-organized, like Christian left lobbying industry of churches who are taking very strident social justice stances. So, one really concrete example of this is there's this building right across from the Supreme Court. Like literally, there's a tiny street across from the Supreme Court from it, but it's also right across from the Capitol building as well, called the United Methodist Building, where there are a ton of smaller faith-based organizations that they have their lobbying operations run out of there. And that was the site where a lot of the planning for the Civil Rights Act happened in the 1960s. And so it was kind of faith-based organizations that were creating the physical space next to Capitol Hill for that strategy, for those strategies to take place. And the faith-based progressive lobbying movement has only grown stronger in the preceding 50 years. So, zoom forward to today, when Congress was considering the repeal of ACA soon after President Trump was elected. One of the key votes in that fight on the Senate floor was Senator Lisa Murkowski. And FCNL, they flew in a constituent a business owner who knew Senator Murkowski really well in Alaska. They flew him in from Alaska, and he was the very last person that she spoke to before she cast her vote not to repeal the ACA. So they have these great relationships that they've formed with members of Congress, especially through their personal constituents, to be able to be in the door. And because they're a faith-based organization, like they speak a similar language to a lot of Republicans, or at least what a lot of Republicans think they speak. Mm-hmm. So they're able to talk about the values of faith and care for neighbor and care for creation. And they're talking about left-wing ideas a lot of the time, but they're talking about it in a language that Republicans can understand.
Sure. So, addressing that sort of, the history of faith-based activism and up until today, we're seeing, I think, especially over the last 20 years, a large desertion either of people of faith from the Democratic Party or vice versa, Democrats getting, less religious. And so, I was curious to hear your analysis on that. I mean, I think that you and I both believe in a strong separation between church and state, so we're not really, talking about that so much, but, this sort of place that faith plays in our politics.
Yeah, absolutely. Faith plays in a lot of ways a very insidious role in our politics. I think there's a guy who I'm a big fan of named Jim Wallace, and I think that this quote is his, and so I'll attribute it to him. He runs a magazine called Sojourners, which is a progressive Christian magazine that talks about politics a lot. And his famous phrase is, mixing politics and religion is a lot like mixing ice cream and manure. You don't really mess up the manure, but you totally ruin the ice cream. And sure. that's actually something that I think faith-based activists need to think really deeply about, is that when you're going up against like the might of the American government with your faith, you need to make sure that those things don't intermix, because if state and church become intertwined, the government is the manure. They're not going to really be changed by it. They're going to, retain their original character, but your faith is going to be totally corrupted. And that's actually, I think, a big reason why you see so many people on the left leaving church spaces, because they see how much the church has been corrupted by the pursuit of power and influence. So I think it's a hugely important problem. There's also just a general trend of people becoming less religion and faith oriented. I think I saw one recent survey measuring the population in 2021, and for the first time, fewer than 50% of people identified as Christians in the United States. Now, I think that is maybe a leading indicator poll. I think some other polls would still put the population at slightly higher, but there's no doubt that over the last 40 years, there's been, an unmistakable trend of secularization. And so much of that is tied up in the fact that the church is so interested in power and influence and not at all interested in, what the church is supposed to be about, which is about community and justice and reconciliation of people to God. And so that is a huge problem. Now, that doesn't mean that I think that the left can give up on faith spaces. And I think there are a few reasons for that. For one thing, even if the country is secularizing rapidly, there are still, a huge swath of the country who come from a faith perspective, and they could really, they're really familiar with that language. It's comforting to them. It's important to their identity. And so if you can connect with them on that level, sometimes you can break through the polarization of politics and get to them on a God level. It's a different strategy to reach people who care about that and might be persuadable. And then the other thing is, at least for me, coming from a Christian perspective, I just think, so much of what progressives stand for is very much in line with what I, read scripture to say that Jesus stands for. And so, I think, as someone on the Christian left, I feel that it's very important to say that we can't seed the ground of this is what Jesus says and this is what Jesus stands for. Because the more we seed that ground, the more the ice cream is going to mix with the manure, and the more Christianity is going to be totally unrecognizable to the Christ of the Bible.
Sure. It's really fascinating. I was curious. You talked about the mixing and how people have been drawn away from churches as a result of this corruption. I was wondering if you've seen in your own spaces, maybe you could talk a little bit about your own faith, your own church, whether there's been any sort of conflict in the progressive left being pro-choice, pro-LGBT rights. If there's any sort of conflict, I guess across the spectrum, but specifically in your own faith community.
Sure, absolutely. So my faith community is called the Church of the Brethren, which is one of the other three historic peace churches. So the three historic peace churches are the Quakers, the Mennonites, who are pretty well known, and then the Brethren. So we kind of all occupy that very pacifist way of approaching Scripture, and that comes from pretty clear messages from Jesus about nonviolence. So we kind of have that shared grounding of nonviolence. Some people interpret that really to only relate to, some people in very extreme cases seem to only really relate that to like, how do you conduct your personal life? Are you a violent person? Like, do you go around attacking people? And if not, maybe you're not a nonviolent person. And then there's, I think the other end of this spectrum, which I think is the very correct end of the spectrum, which says, there's all kinds of violence that are enacted upon that becomes enacted upon people, and so much of it is not what you classically think of as violence. It's not punching someone in the face or shooting them with a gun. Our structures are violent. Poverty is violent. War is violent. Climate change is violent to marginalized communities today, and broadly to future generations. And so I think that we have to have an expansive definition of what it means to be non-violent that isn't just not being violent, but opposing violence in all its forms, including its structural forms. So that becomes, on the one hand, nonviolence can be a unifying idea, but on the other hand, how you see that applying in other areas of life can be very different, or leads you to very different places. So yes, my church is definitely very divided on certain, social issues that have a distinctly theological lens to people. So you mentioned, I think, what are probably the two biggest ones, which are abortion and LGBTQ rights. Our church hasn't really had any explicit fights on abortion in a long time. I think that the church's official statement is pretty anti-abortion, unfortunately, and pretty anti-choice. But I think that people kind of live and let live with that topic because, our church structures don't talk about it very much. And it doesn't affect your like standing in the church because it's such a private matter. I certainly wish that the church would be more willing to be a pro-choice church, and that's something that we need to fight for. But the much bigger grounds where there's a lot of infighting in the church is definitely on LGBTQ rights. So the church last issued an authoritative kind of interpretation that binds the whole denomination 40 years ago in the 1980s on its stance on same-sex marriage. And so you can imagine, especially coming out of that time period, what the stance is. Much of the church it's probably half and half. Half want to see the church recognize same-sex marriage, for congregations to be able to conduct same-sex marriages and for pastors to be able to conduct them. About half the church feels the opposite way. And actually just in the past year or so, there's been a pretty big group that has broken off from the church. Because even though the church continues, as a matter of policy to hold their opinion, which is that the church shouldn't recognize same-sex marriage, they see that the church is moving in what I think is the much more just direction of embracing same-sex couples as fully in communion with the church and with God. And so they've broken off, which, I feel sad about, in the sense that you never want to see your faith community, which is already pretty small. It's like 100,000 people. You don't want to see it break apart, but, I'd much rather see it embrace same-sex marriage. And so I think that the compromises or the trade-off is well worth it in my mind.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that on something like this, people would feel so strongly to where they would break off denominationally. That's unfortunate.
Yeah, I don't understand it. Although if you look at the history of splits within the Church of the Brethren over its history, some of the other splits have been like around the way that people dress. Some people have a perspective or like a image in their mind of who Mennonites are, and they typically picture like old order dressing, like not modern clothing. And the Brethren used to be that way as well. And it was kind of at the turn of the 19th to 20th century that the church had its most major schism over the question of how people should dress. Yeah.
It seems like such a small deal now in hindsight, but I'm sure it was quite the schism.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, before we move on to the second topic, which I was wondering about working for Nina Totenberg, I think it's also important to recognize that as we talk about, religious activism on the left, I think a lot of people picture when they think about evangelicals, they think of, white people living in rural areas. And obviously one of the biggest religious constituencies, particularly in the Democratic Party, is Black Americans who are mostly, I think, Baptist, correct? I mean, I might be a little wrong, but many of them are entrenched in their faith communities, and I think it's really unfortunate. One of the big criticisms that we see is, as many white liberals have embraced secularization, not just in the political sense, but also in their own sense, in the way that they interact with people who find meaning in faith. It's definitely, I think, pretty alienating, especially for people who find themselves among left activism, civil rights activism, etc. And it's definitely, I think, something that we all need to, as someone who's relatively secular, something we all need to work on in being more inclusive in our own spaces. So
Yeah, I think that is a keen observation. It's, I think, a real I think it's something that Democrats need to be really worried about. So, for instance, in the 2020 election, you saw a shift among Black voters and especially among Latinx voters away from Democrats towards Republicans. And I don't think you can point to any one feature, but I think you would be remiss not to note that those two constituencies within the Democratic Party are some of the most religious constituencies of the party. And they've been, more or less stalwart Democrats for, in the case of Black voters, for a generation, and for Latinx voters for several election cycles. And if you continue to be derisive of religious faith, and if you go too much towards secular identity as being the core, part of the core identity of what it means to be a Democrat, you're going to make it much harder for those voters to stay within the party. Now, that doesn't mean that you can compromise on some of the key issues that are sometimes seen as behind that wedge. You can't compromise on choice. You can't compromise on LGBT rights. You can't compromise on the embrace of science. And I don't think that those constituencies are asking you to do any of that. I think they're perfectly willing to go along with that. In fact, they've shown that they are. What they're not willing to do is countenance total disrespect or derision of their faith perspective. I think you want to talk to those voters in that language that's so important to them as a source of comfort and pride and identity. And I'll return to the point that I think that there's some hope in reaching certain segments of white evangelical or Protestant or Catholic voters on economic issues, and that's certainly something you should emphasize. But I think that talking to them through the language of Christ, which for so many of them, at least in their own self-conception, is so much more central to who they are than their political identity. It just seems like a much savvier way of trying to reach those people. Now, I don't think that the Democratic Party itself should be talking, in explicitly religious terms all the time. That's, it's kind of unseemly for a political party to do that, and it raises questions about, the separation of church and faith. But you need to have actors within the party who are competent and fluent in those areas and come from that perspective. And so, for instance, I am really excited that Raphael Warnock is now a sitting United States senator. He occupies the pulpit once occupied by Martin Luther King Jr. and can speak from a faith perspective and in a way that I think is really important for people to hear a Christian talking about on the left.
Yeah, definitely. And Yeah, that's all I think I have to say on the topic. I appreciate your insight. So I guess we'll shift gears. You work for Nina. Well, of course you know, but for our audience, you worked for Nina Totenberg last summer, who's a long-time Supreme Court reporter for NPR. And she's a hard worker. I've heard your own experiences. And so I'd hope you tell us a little bit about how your summer went, what it's like to work with her, and kind of what the day-to-day is like covering the Supreme Court.
Yeah, so I was, as you said, Nina Totenberg's legal intern for the summer at NPR, affectionately known as her Tote interns, which she has one intern per semester. So there's one that works in the fall, one that works in the spring, and then one that works in the summer. And one of the things I didn't expect, considering that she's probably the most well-known Supreme Court reporter and certainly a legend in her field, is that her team is it's not even a skeleton crew. It's literally her and her intern, and her editor works with her, but obviously her editor is working on many other areas as well. And then there's a technical producer that will work with her, but obviously that producer is also working in many areas as well. So I was blown away by the fact that her team is so small, which meant that I was handed a ton of responsibility in covering the court. So the day-to-day of covering the court, broadly speaking, whether you're Nina or you're Adam Litek at the New York Times or Mark Joseph Stern at Slate or any of their lowly interns, really revolves around a few things. So on the show is opinion day. At least when I was there in the summer, the arguments aren't happening anymore. I sat in on one argument, and it's unusual for a summer intern to hear any arguments. So hearing arguments wasn't a big part of what I do. Obviously, during the fall and the spring when arguments are happening, that's a huge part of what they do. But for me, it was whenever an opinion day would come around, those opinions start to be released at 10 a.m. on that morning. It's often a Monday morning or a Thursday morning. The court will let reporters know the day before when opinions are coming, or sometimes a few days before, so we kind of know to be watching. And then you just sit at supremecourt.gov and you refresh and you refresh and you refresh until the opinion comes down. There are all kinds of little secret tricks to know when an opinion is coming, and especially they don't tell you how many opinions are coming on a particular day, so you need to know if there are extra opinions coming. So for instance, there is the opinions appear in a little chart on the just a really basic Word 2000 little chart on the court's website, and if what's called an R number has been assigned to the opinion, which basically lists the number that the opinion is in all the opinions the court has issued that term, you know that the lid is on, that all the opinions have been released that day. But if the R number doesn't appear, then you at least know to expect another opinion in 5 to 10 minutes, and you have no idea what's coming. The only other clue is they're released in reverse seniority. So for instance, just today opinions were released, and Amy Coney Barrett, her opinion was released first because she's the least senior justice on the court. And then Brett Kavanaugh had an opinion, and he is the second least senior justice. So there weren't any R numbers, and the 2 least senior justices had released opinions. So you knew another opinion was coming, but you couldn't know who of the 7 people it was. And it turned out they were all, one was about Facebook and kind of important, but they were none of them were super major cases.
Oh, I have to go check the Facebook case. I didn't realize so many came out. I always get disoriented when cases come down before June, because I expect the biggest cases to just be held over until June.
So there will be a few that were argued in the fall that will be released earlier than June that are more high profile. So probably the biggest one that you can expect to be released before June is the Fulton versus City of Philadelphia case, which is a case about whether the city can can stop adoption agencies from discriminating against LGBTQ couples.
Almost certainly, I think with the current, unless you see something different with the current composition of the court, I'm not too optimistic about that case.
Yeah, I'm not optimistic about the case, both in terms of the result, which I think is almost certainly to favor the agencies in allowing them to discriminate, but also, unfortunately, there's a pretty core separation of church and state case, at play in that case called Employment Division versus Smith. And there is at least, I think court watchers and commentators seem to be pretty skeptical that Smith will be overturned in this case. Maybe they're right, but there is at least a strong chance in my mind that it gets overturned. Anyway,
we
get released. You read them and analyze them and tell the public about them. That's the biggest part of the job.
Yeah, we can, so we'll go back to that in a second. I think it's fine if we take, a few minutes for a detour. Talking about Smith, for listeners that don't know, was a case decided in, I think, 1990, written by Scalia, which pretty much determined, in that case, there were Native Americans who smoked peyote, and then I think they got kicked off unemployment benefits because they tested positive or something like that, or that was the reason they were fired. I can't remember the exact details, but essentially the doctrine was that you can't get a religious exemption to otherwise generally applicable laws.
Right.
And it's something that at first was taken very harshly. The vast majority of Americans, if I remember in polling, disagreed with Smith. And actually, in response, Congress implemented the Religious Freedom Restoration Act as a direct response to Smith. So it's very intense. And in that case, it was relatively interesting because I think that, Smith, decided by Scalia, was opposed by many liberals. And nowadays it's kind of flipped. It's very clear that RFRA is supported by conservatives, especially on LGBT and contraception issues, and not so much by liberals. And I think it's still very controversial because I talked about RFRA in one of my classes and still was surprised that many people were generally against the way Smith was decided. But I was interested if you could elaborate a little bit more on your views, if you've got robust ones on Smith, especially since you covered some of the stuff related to it.
Yeah, I don't know if I have robust views on Smith, although I certainly agree with most of, or everything that you said. I think, certainly Smith is not a perfect opinion, and the fact that it's a Scalia opinion probably tips you off that I don't love everything that's in it. But one of the really scary things about this court is its very clear and entrenched agenda at expanding the rights of religious people, particularly against the rights of other types of minorities and people acting in other areas of society. So I think that there's even before Justice Ginsburg died and was replaced by Amy Coney Barrett, I think there was no area where the court was moving faster to the right than on religious liberty and the separation of church and state. There were several really important cases that I covered with Nina last term that eroded that boundary, and I think that that Smith is another potential domino to fall in the court's agenda of expanding the rights of religious believers who they mainly identify with Christians, and that's who they really see as expanding their rights. And what happens, as you can see in this Fulton versus City of Philadelphia case, is that comes at the expense of people like LGBT couples that are trying to adopt children.
Yeah, and I mean, the big thing is, I can't be 100% certain, but I almost feel like this will be held, it'll be a one-sided sort of jurisprudence moving forward, where Christians will be permitted to do whatever. And, if we get another peyote case, I'm not so sure that the court's still going to be like, an overturning Smith is going to be okay with that. Or, right now we've got, I think the Church of Satan or whatever is trying to do ritual abortions or whatever, which is, their kind of way at trying to challenge Smith in their own way.
There was a death penalty case about 2 years ago where the court said that it was totally permissible for a state, I think it was Texas or Alabama, to execute a person on death row without, who was requesting that their imam, their Muslim clergy, be present. And the prison basically denied that request and went forward with the execution, and so that person was denied the last rights and comfort of their religious faith. And you're lying to yourself if you think that the court would have come out the same way if it had been a Christian who was denied his right to speak to his pastor before being executed.
For sure. Yeah, it's a rough area. I guess the last thing related to your job is I'm curious what, working as a journalist, you're always on deadline, you're working really fast. Like, what is it like, to have, you get a decision, it might be long, 70 pages or whatever, and then you've got a deadline, you're working with a journalist. How is the whole process there?
Yeah, the opinion days were hectic days. You worked from, I mean, you prepared in the morning, kind of going over what you thought were likely to come down that day and hoping you were right. And so you were up early in the morning, kind of preparing, and then you would not stop working until 10, 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 o'clock if it was a really big day. And you wouldn't eat or anything in the meantime. It's just constant work. So what happens is the opinion comes down, you're refreshing, opinion comes down, you read it as quickly as you can. As any law student will know, the Supreme Court has what's called a syllabus at the top of their opinions that you can kind of scan over and hopefully get the holding. Now, it's not always certain that journalists who, many of them are not trained lawyers, will understand the full holding right away. And so you at least, I would say, if it's an issue of political salience, the next thing you do is check who wrote the opinion and sometimes even more importantly, who's in the dissent. So for instance, there was a case called McGirt this past year that was written by a conservative justice, Neil Gorsuch. But you knew this was a federal Indian law case, and you knew that Gorsuch had some tendency to be sympathetic to Native American tribes, and so you could imagine that he would be siding with the liberals, and that turned out to be the case. He wrote the opinion, but it was all the conservative justices who were in dissent. Um, so so you read the opinion, you look at you read the syllabus, you look at who wrote the opinion and who are in dissent, and you can probably from that figure out how the case came down. And so then at that point, you are already releasing information to the public about what happened. So as soon as I know what happened, I had the reins on Nina's Twitter account, and so I would tweet out, a one-line summary. The court ruled that Title VII applies to same-sex or to LGBT people in the workplace, or in the case of the Boston case, whatever, just so the public knows. And then throughout the day, you continue to update the public on what happened. Before all of this happens, on the big cases, you'll have done at least a preliminary, what's called a pre-write. So you're able to basically have a framework of an article in place. You'll have a version of if one side won versus a version if the other side won, or sometimes you'll even have multiple versions within that. If it's like, this is like a really big victory for LGBTQ people, or this is a moderate victory for LGBTQ people, or this is a big defeat, and so on. And so you're able to pick out quickly which of those pre-written versions is correct and plug in any vital information you need, like who wrote the opinion, what was the vote count, 7-2, 6-3, etc. And so you release that out within half an hour or less of the opinion coming out, so that you start to have analysis, and then you just continue to update as it goes along. Now, Nina obviously works at NPR, and so the biggest part of her job is producing radio segments that cover the court that will play sometimes in the morning when the decision comes out, and sometimes they'll play at their afternoon news show. So if it's a really big case like Bostock, she'll basically cut in live to the production, to whatever morning news show is playing, and she'll give a brief summary, and she'll be interviewed by the host, and she just basically has the main hits and will say, I don't have all the information, but this is what the court said. That will be pretty brief and generally not too substantive. But then her whole day for the rest of the day is putting together a radio segment for the afternoon at 4 o'clock or so. So she'll interview experts to get their perspective. She will write a radio script that describes what happened and ties the quotes of the experts all together. My job during that time is to read the opinion really thoroughly and pull out all the key points from the majority opinion as well as the concurrences and dissents, so that she has more stuff to reference. And then we put that all together and we package it up, and she records it and sends it off to the radio. The experts, by the way, is another fun part of the job. And I think that this is pretty standard across Supreme Court journalism now.
Yeah.
I mentioned earlier in the conversation, you don't know what is coming any particular day, but you have the desire that you want to talk to experts in the field who can help you break down both the legal reasoning, but also the significance of what happened. And so there's kind of a catch-22 of how do you line up people to interview on a particular day when you don't know when it's coming. And so she has like a big matrix of potential interviewees. where literally the day before every single opinion, I'll confirm we'll have lined up all these people for like 10, literally like 10 cases. We'll say, if the opinion comes tomorrow, just to confirm you're available at this time, and we'll set that. And then when if the opinion doesn't come out, then amid all the other stuff I have to do, I have to email those people again and say, the opinion didn't come today. Can we reconfirm you for the next opinion day, which is probably next Monday or whatever. And then for the, wow. For the several experts who were on tap, you email them and say, the opinion came today, so please be ready at 12 o'clock or whatever to talk to Nina.
Sure. My last question is, I think there's been some interest in the way that the Supreme Court is covered by journalists. Mm-hmm. And I think Nina Totenberg, being at NPR, covers it in a pretty I'd say objective, not subjective, partisan way.
Yeah.
Whereas, there are other journalists who cover it in like a more progressive way, more, of course, conservative way on the other side. Mm-hmm. And I was just wondering whether you had your own views on the way that it's responsible and appropriate to cover the court, and whether you find one strategy more appealing than another.
So I don't think it's necessarily about one being appropriate versus another. I think that what Nina does is an important public service in that she has to, you only get, even on a huge case like Bostock, you only get 4 minutes of radio time. And so you need to use that time that you have to communicate what happened. And you need to be able to communicate it in terms that, not only will people understand, in the sense of plain language, but also that people will, they'll go along with your analysis of. And so if you sound totally biased, they're gonna shut you out. And so in that 4 minutes that Nina has to do radio coverage, I think it's totally legitimate that she kind of plays it more neutrally by the book. And then she does talk to those experts who can give a more partisan perspective on what it is. Usually she'll talk to one person on one side and one person on the other side, or two of each or whatever. Mm. So, you have a good balance in that sense of the neutral with the partisan perspective. And that way she can remain a trusted source. I think that people really trust Nina's journalism in part because of that. Now, personally, I am, a progressive. This was something that I myself struggled with even as an intern covering the court, is how do you, on the one hand, recognize your job as an intern for a pretty down the center news organization to communicate just the facts, while also, you have a strong perspective on these cases as well. Which is why I think it's really important that we have people like Mark Joseph Stern, or we have the 5 to 4 podcasts, which I absolutely love, who are taking a much more, not just progressive, but I think really importantly, critical take on the court. Like, they have a really strong sense of the analysis of power. They kind of reject this idea that justices are brains floating in a vat, and instead are, pretty interested political actors, many of whom worked in partisan politics in one way or another before becoming judges. So if you're not talking about that, and if there's no voices that are, relaying that perspective, then you're missing something, and you're ultimately doing a disservice to the public, because you're not communicating the full story. You're telling about the doctrine and the legal analysis, but you're not talking about what are the human reasons that the justices arrived at that decision. I think that Nina actually, she does do some of that as well. Like, she does longer feature pieces that talk about some of the background and personal motivations of the justices. I think that she does better than some journalists at covering the people on the court, in addition to the legal ideas that they represent. But I'm really glad that there's partisan media as well that is more willing to cover, call bullshit and cover the politics that's behind everything that's happening.
Yeah, and I do know that, like, one of the things that was really controversial that Nina Totenberg has done is before the confirmation of Clarence Thomas, she was one of the very first journalists, I think, that hopped on the Anita Hill allegations. And a lot of people, I think, at that time felt it was not appropriate to come in so early as someone who worked for public broadcasting. So I think that was one of the big times where she really stepped in and took a role.
Yeah, and by the way, that's I think a totally crazy critique of that. Like that's exactly what a journalist is supposed to do. They're not supposed to be the lapdogs of power. They're supposed to be the people that are exposing what powerful people have done or are accused of having done. And I think that Nina has been totally vindicated by history in pushing that story and making sure that it got the attention that it did. At the end of the day, her job wasn't to say you should confirm Clarence Thomas or not. Her job was to say you need to know all the facts about Clarence Thomas, and this is a really important fact that unless I push, it might not get covered at all. And I think we all owe her a debt of gratitude for doing that then, and I think it has contributed to the willingness of journalists to be able to cover the wrongdoing and the personal lives of powerful people today.
Definitely. Thanks so much, Emmett, for joining me. Is there anything you want to plug? Any Twitter or YouTube, whatever you got?
Sure. You can follow me on Twitter. It's at Emmett Eldred, EMMETTELDRED. There's not much of value going on there, but that's what I.
You got quite the quirky and witty Twitter account.
It's most of my Twitter account is just Eli and me responding to one another. So
that's true. We do that a lot, but it's good banter. And once I take myself off private one day, you all too can see what I talk about. All right, thanks Emmett for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eli. It was fun.